$2 to $3 a barrel. And then we had the Israeli problem in the Middle East, and certain Arab countries decided to use their control of oil as a weapon against the occupation of Palestine. And we had the first oil shock in 1973. They embargoed just for a few months United States and Netherlands, who were perceived to be particular allies of Israel. And the price of oil went up 5 times in the matter of almost overnight. And then only a few years after that, there was the fall of the Shah. And this triggered a second oil shock. And this was occasioned not by any embargo or any action by anybody. It was just panic buying in the West, who feared that the fall of the Shah would interrupt Iranian supply, itself not all that significant in a world sense, but enough to create a small shortage. And in the way the oil is traded, the price is set by the marginal barrel, so that a small surplus or a small shortage has an entirely disproportionate effect to the overall supply. So there was panic buying in the West, and oil, in today's prices, oil shot up to almost $100 a barrel briefly, and this tipped the world into recession. And recession then curbed demand. The demand fell, reduced pressure on price, and so it was about 12 years before the production of oil rose again to the level it had been in 1979. And then, of course, we had the boom years. The 80s and the 90s was an economic boom throughout the world. The demand for oil rose at about 1.5% to 2% a year consistently over this period, and the industry succeeded in supplying it, partly still coming from the Middle East under the control of OPEC, and partly from the offshore. This whole new province was opened up the offshore at Alaska and North Sea, which supplied the oil that was needed to meet this growing demand. But then by about 2000, we began to feel the capacity limits. There's a lot of rubbish spoken about spare capacity. Spare capacity can mean many different things, but let's say capacity that can be turned on by opening a valve, that kind of capacity, the world was beginning to run out of it at late 2000. There just wasn't enough around anywhere. The Middle East is having to run ever faster to stand still as it offsets the natural decline of its old fields found more than 50 years ago. It's not surprising they're declining. So I think in 2000 we began to feel the edge of this capacity limit. And probably nobody quite saw it as such, but the traders at their screens were beginning to see that there was more demand than there was supply being offered. And the price of oil began to move upwards through the 30s, again up through 30, 35, 36. And I personally thought, this is it, fellows, so we've reached the capacity limit, we're facing $50, $60 a barrel quite soon. But I was wrong, because as before, and as in all previous occasions, the sudden surge in the price of oil led to recession. In part, there are probably other factors as well, but probably a coincidence of this oil price shock and the dot-com bubble and all of those other things tipped the world back into recession. Demand fell such that production in 2001 is 5% down. This doesn't sound a huge swing, but in this very delicate market with the price set by this marginal barrel, it was enough to depress the price of oil, and so oil fell back down to the low 20s for a while, even briefly below. And then OPEC has great trouble in enforcing its own rules. Its members cheat, of course, and so it tried to stabilize things, and now it's up in the mid-20s again. And of course, if we now have a war in the next few weeks or months, then one can, well, it's impossible to forecast the outcome of that, but the likely outcome is that oil prices just go through the roof, because there is no way production can be brought on quickly in Iraq, and there's no place else, and the whole tension and uncertainty would likely lead to high oil prices. But ignoring a war, let's say we manage to avoid this war somehow, and let's say that the economy should begin to pick up again in the near future. Well, as the economy picks up, oil demand will pick up in parallel until it again hits this capacity limit, which is falling all the time. And so I see a picture unfolding in the next few years of a kind of vicious circle. As the economy tries to improve, it hits the capacity limit, that in turn imposes recession again, falls off again, and you have a probably an escalating system of repeating oil shocks and recessions and oil price shocks and recessions until some kind of new stability unfolds in the future, and not too far in the future, when recognition of this underlying depletion situation is absorbed into the economic system of the world, and somehow it comes to live with it in some kind of equilibrium, because obviously the world can't go on with recurring recessions and booms. That no one that wouldn't be a feasible thing to go on too long. Oil is not infinitely elastic, so even recession can't curb it forever, because in particular we rely on oil for agriculture. I don't think we've mentioned that particularly, that for the new types of crop that has been developed to produce wheat and so forth depend heavily on nutrients, artificial nutrients, and these are made from hydrocarbons, gas particularly. They also have a voracious appetite for water, and water is commonly pumped by diesel-driven pumps, and not to mention the mechanized farming, the transport, the storage, and all of that. So we have seen, in fact, an almost exact parallel between the growth of oil over the last 150 years and a corresponding growth in population. So you could see a close link between population, which has increased threefold during the lifetime of the present Queen of England, and the growing amount of oil that has supplied not only the energy for the economy, but more directly the food with which to live, supply all these people. And so it poses the question of, when oil peaks and begins to decline around 210, let's say, well, what does that do for people? So I sure don't have an answer to that question, but it's certainly something to ask.
How have governments reacted?
Yes, the way governments react is a very good question, and it's really an extraordinary situation. Just take, let's say, the British government as an example. Well, no one really expected to find oil in the North Sea, and it was only during the late 60s that the potential of the North Sea became evident. And at that time was a socialist government, and you had the British Gas Council and various nationalised institutes and institutions, and you could say that energy policy was a matter for government concern. And the Gas Council and these official bodies did take a long-term view of it. They checked their contracts with the oil companies back to the reservoir. They wanted to know for sure what was available in order to plan their whole activities. But then after Mrs. Thatcher blew all that away, then you have an open market, and there's a great belief in the open market that under the classical laws of economics, if you have an open market, supply will always match demand. If wheat prices go up, the farmer grows more in the next season. This is embedded mindset in many of the advisors to government. And so we had a free-for-all really in Britain. They opened the floodgates, and there were very nice tax arrangements whereby all the costs were written off against taxable income, so the companies weren't really spending real money to do all of this. And we've had a great surge in discovery. And for a brief period, it looked an enormous success story. And heard Nigel Lawson the other day compliment himself on his wisdom in creating all of this. He said, look, in earlier years people warned me about depletion, but I rejected the advice, and I felt we should go forward with market principles and let loose this great ingenuity of mankind and all of those good things. And here he said, look at us today, production is way up on what it was before. It's been a great success story, but somehow even now he hadn't appreciated that he's looking peak in the face and a decline that follows. That means that Britain had this fortunate windfall of falling into oil and gas in its own territories, which early years nobody would have expected. And they blew it all away in 20 years or so, and the mere fact that they overproduced in this short